able to be with you on this great occasion of the celebration of the 50th anniversary of CODESRIA. Since its inception, I have been associated with CODESRIA. CODESRIA has played a decisive role in the rise and consolidation of African social science for liberation of a continent. Through different and varying topics and themes, CODESRIA has investigated the dynamic of African societies and politics. Seminars, general assemblies, publications, the bulletin, all this has contributed to shaping the identity of CODESRIA as a champion in the field of social science research in Africa. I myself owe my intellectual and scientific trajectory to CODESRIA. The achievement of CODESRIA have been realized through the dedication of a number of colleagues, chiefly among them, the late Samir Amin, Tandika Mokandavire, may they rest in peace. But also Bayo Olukoshi, and of course, Abdallah Bulhura. But those executive secretaries have been able to achieve their work through their dedication, thanks to the support of the administrative and technical staff over the years. I would like, on the occasion of this 50th anniversary, express my gratitude and my heartfelt congratulations to all. And I call on all the new generation of researchers to keep the torch alight. A luta continua. Thank you.
Greetings to CODESRIA and the participants of this special General Assembly. I am Diana Arsenian, Vice President of the International Program at Carnegie Corporation of New York. On behalf of the corporation's trustees, President Dame Louise Richardson, and the staff of the Higher Education and Research in Africa program area, I congratulate CODESRIA for this significant half-a-century milestone. Now, lasting for 50 years is a major accomplishment for any NGO around the world. For CODESRIA, it is a testament to its mission, effectiveness, and commitment of partners and stakeholders within and outside of Africa. CODESRIA's special place in the Pan-African and global scientific and scholarly landscape has been tirelessly cultivated by institutions' leadership, staff, and relevant communities. So we congratulate all of you, and we congratulate CODESRIA for all that it has accomplished over the past half a century, and send our best wishes for the next half a century and more to come. Thank you.
Okay, good afternoon. Thank you, everybody. So those were two messages from Diana Arsenian from the Carnegie Corporation, New York, and the second message was from Abdoulaye Bachili, who is a special representative of the UN Secretary General to Libya. We're still waiting for the chair of the panel. Oh, he's here. Okay, so without further ado, we'll listen to the final panel for the day. And we are very squeezed for time. Yeah, thank you very much.
I know that you've had a very long day, and that the small subject of reparations merits a quick discussion in the final session of the day. What I'm going to do is ask two of my panelists. I have one panelist that's joining online. I just want to make sure that that panelist is still joining. What we've agreed is I will ask each of the panelists briefly introduce themselves, give us top lines of the subject in 5 minutes, and then having done so, I will ask 1 or 2 questions, then we'll come to the audience because we had already started in the previous sessions a discussion on reparations. As Professor Adebayo Olukoshi already hinted in the earlier session, there have been 12 reparations initiatives led out of Africa, and at least 8 of those were by the OAU and championed in between by the late MK or Abiola. These initiatives went to the extent of getting heads of state resolutions and also to the extent of setting up an eminent persons group. Professor Bacheli, Madame Grassa Machel, and some people that I saw in this room were part of that eminent persons group. But by way of framing this session, it's being in Gorée Island or being close to Gorée Island. Many people go there for tourist reasons. Many people go to Cape Coast in Ghana for tourist reasons. And many people go to Robben Island in South Africa for tourist reasons. I think for the purposes of these conversations, let's agree that these are crime scenes of mass atrocities, as a first thing. The second thing is to be clear that the reparations being talked about by the current movements, that's linking Africa, the Caribbean, Latin America, Europe, Asia Pacific, are reparations for the following. Reparations for the enslavement of Africans and the racialized chattel slavery, reparations for colonialism, and reparations for apartheid, because it's useful that we talk about them in those entities. Why? In the sense that they speak to 3 things. The question of the historical factor that what became revolts or rebellions against white colonialism or European colonialism was actuated by grievances relating to forcible expropriation of property by way of imposition of taxes, by way of dispossession of land, by way, if you were the Khoi and the San in South Africa, dispossession of cattle. So there is an economic dimension to reparations. If you think about the Caribbean that we'll hear about, white needs, white greed, white convenience, and white fragilities coincided into forming some of the wealthiest land and sugar barons in Europe, in the United Kingdom. So the link between slavery and the later stage colonialism and industrialization is one that I think that the speakers will allude to. Lastly, I just wanted us to keep in mind that slavery, the reparations is not just about compensation. Reparations is guaranteeing non-recurrence. Reparations is not just looking at the local experience. Reparations is looking at the global system that sustained it, and that global system anchored on white supremacy, but on global division of labor, and etc. I'm not a speaker today, so I will not get into my usual conversations about repair, but I wanted perhaps as a teaser, as I turn First to you, Arley. You know, it's almost inevitable and given that in our conversations, even black people themselves don't seem to believe that the black body is worthy of repair, unless it is in the service of capital. So the same black people who can get workman's compensation are not seen as deserving of repair. That's number one. Number two, that each time people want to make a claim, they are told it'll suffer from statutes of limitations. That means the offender wishes or insists that their own law be applied to judge atrocities that they created and committed against the other. And then three, people seem to believe that a lot of time has passed, and therefore it is indeterminate. It's difficult for us to tell how best to do this in a logical manner. For some reason, that the harm and the hurt that our people suffer should be erased or can be erased, and yet the harm and the hurt that others suffer is not possible to erase. So I'm going to start with you to frame the CARICOM has gone further than most in its reparations endeavors. And then I'm going to come to you, James, as a lawyer who's looking at the link between climate, the global financial architecture, the local experience within Africa, to tell us your take on these issues. Was it systemic, and if so? And Lilliane, you've been doing very specific emblematic cases, looking at cases of dispossession under the colonial system. Many of you know this because you've done the studies. There was rampant rape of black women by whether you call it the colonialists and within the slave plantations and elsewhere. And when this happened, the mixed race children were forcibly taken away from their mothers, amongst other things. And Lilliane, you've also been looking at the campaigns, the Belgian reparations and the recent campaigns in Europe. So I'll ask that you reflect on this. So don't assume that all of us work on reparations, but also don't assume that we don't know. What is the reparation struggle that Hilary Beckles says is the most important social justice question of the 21st century? What is it? And how can it galvanize us as a collective? And James, is there any basis? Is this just a fuzzy emotional appeal? And Lilliane, where do you situate women, the bodies of women and the intellect of women, women in their diversity and wholeness in this conversation? And where do you situate young people, because you've been asking critical questions about young people? So take your 7 minutes, and then we'll come to the audience.
Thank you very much, Brian, and I will try to do justice in the 7 minutes. I bring you warm and fraternal greetings from a very small island in the Caribbean called Grenada, population of approximately 110,000 people. I know it can probably stay in a village somewhere close by. Allow me, as I begin, to congratulate CODESRIA on its 50th anniversary, and to thank you so much for that invitation that you have extended to the CARICOM Reparations Commission. CARICOM is sort of the equivalent of what you have as the African Union. So the CARICOM speaks of the nations that come together as a Caribbean community. And to thank you for CODESRIA for all the warm and the proper arrangements that have been made to facilitate my presence here and to speak at your conference. Of course, the fact that reparation now is a subject at your esteemed conference means that we are going places. Now, just to land basically what we speak of when we speak of reparations and where we are in the Caribbean, reparations really speak to repair. Repair for the damage caused. And we, in the Caribbean, by first of all what we refer to as indigenous holocaust or indigenous genocide, the Atlantic slave trade and slavery. When we speak of indigenous genocide or indigenous holocaust, and you heard me right, because so many times when we speak of Holocaust, we only refer to one people. But they were the first peoples of the Caribbean, first settlers of the Caribbean, that we refer to as the Amerindians, the Arawaks and the Kalinagos and so on. And they were basically exterminated, killed out by the European invaders who took their lands and from there came to Africa and kidnapped and traded human beings, Africans or African ancestors as slaves. So when we speak of reparations, we begin with our first settlers of the Caribbean, our indigenous people, first peoples. Then we continue with the Atlantic slave trade and the horrors that our forefathers experienced by being kidnapped, by being treated as human beings. Just recently, you would have learned or read or heard that Lloyd's Insurance in the United Kingdom, they have made some offer, which we do not consider as reparations, of some 50 million pounds to development of people, descendants of the formerly enslaved. When we speak of the Atlantic slave trade, you have to appreciate that the cargo of human beings were insured by insurance companies in the United Kingdom, Lloyd's of London, who made millions and millions of profits. So we speak of indigenous genocide, the Atlantic slave trade, and of course, chattel enslavement. Now this issue of chattel slavery is the legal determination that enslaved Africans were non-human, was an invention of Europeans within the Caribbean colonies. The denial of the human identity of Africans and their economic and social usage as property. So that when we speak of chattel slavery, the black bodies were considered to be property, as your shirt, your pants, your car, your house, to be bought and sold and to be traded. And that, of course, in time would have led to the superiority complex of the whites and the inferiority complex of black people. So that racism, in a real sense, that we experience now is by no means an accident. Then we can get to the issue of the emancipation without reparations. Now, the British, they would have passed legislation in Barbados, for instance, in 1636, which deemed all enslaved Africans as the property of the purchasers and heirs forever. In 1661, this legal principle was fully developed in the first of a series of slave codes in the form of acts for the governance of Negroes. And to add insult to injury, we would have heard about the Abolition Act or the Emancipation Act. That act was one of the most deceptive bits of legislation passed by the British Parliament, because what it did was, one, to officially recognize enslaved Africans as non-humans and to reaffirm their legal status as property. Two, to pay property compensation as a form of financial reparations to enslavers. And three, to exclude any and all forms of payments of reparations to the emancipated. And four, and to sustain the social and economic structures of domination by the white elite. In other words, on the abolition of slavery in 1833, the British Parliament made evaluation of a loss of property to the enslavers, and they estimated that it would happen around, that the loss to the enslavers was around 47 million pounds. What did they do? They then took a loan of 20 million pounds from Rothschild Bank, a Jewish bank, to pay the enslavers. Yes, that loan they only finished paying in the year 2015. So for those persons who think that when we speak of reparations, we're speaking about centuries-old issues, we are not. We're speaking about the loan that the British took to pay the enslavers. They only finished paying that loan to Rothschild Bank in 2015. The other 27 million pounds, they concocted and designed a program called the apprenticeship period, which originally was for 10 years. But that apprenticeship period was basically forced labor of the formerly enslaved persons to give now free labor to the former slave owners. In that way, the emancipated or the formerly enslaved persons were actually contributing to paying the enslavers for their freedom in a real sense and a real manner of speaking. And that is why we say deception. The Abolition Act never contemplated compensation for the enslaved. So that, just briefly, the CARICOM Reparations Commission was initiated in 2013 by CARICOM countries. This is an initiative by heads of government of the Caribbean region. And that motion was moved by Prime Minister of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Prime Minister Ralph Gonsalves. And we are chaired by the Vice Chancellor of the University of the West Indies, the renowned Sir Hilary Beckles. Now, what we have come up with now, when we speak of reparations, a lot of our people ask how much money we're getting, how much dollars my family will get or your family will get. Now, when we speak of reparations, however, we have come up with what we refer to as a 10-point plan, which is essentially a developmental plan. So we're not speaking about monies in our individual pockets or the pockets of our families. That 10-point plan is constantly under review, and we are in the process now of reviewing it. Yes? And just briefly, just to go through it, the first point of our plan is a full formal apology. Now, here in Africa, we have different religions, Islam, Christian, and so on. Mostly in the Caribbean, we Christians. And we were taught by the same European colonizers that to get forgiveness for our sins, that we have to repent. In other words, admit that we have sinned and fall short of the glory. We are saying to the colonizers that the first step in this act of reparation is to apologize. Admit that what you have committed is crimes against humanity. And you would have heard Brian spoke of some of the crime scenes. The Caribbean plantations were essentially crime scenes that the Europeans walked away from after emancipation and then independence. The second point of our 10-point plan is repatriation. And earlier I saw my Rastafarian brother from Jamaica. In real essence, the Rastafarians in the Caribbean has remained, in a sense, the core of consciousness and the reparation movement for many years in the Caribbean, when mainstream society wouldn't accept these realities. Repatriation, we're saying that since we were forcibly removed from the continent, that the Europeans, they must pay the cost of returning those of us who wish to return. The third point is indigenous. Our third point on our plan is the Indigenous Peoples Development Program. I spoke about the First Peoples. They continue to be a marginalized grouping in the Caribbean. We have large Kalinago communities on the island of Dominica, and we're saying that we need a special program to empower and to develop our indigenous peoples. The fourth point, cultural institutions. The museums and libraries and so on that you see in Europe with regards to learning and teaching of chattel slavery, the Atlantic slave trade, and indigenous peoples. We do not have any of it in the Caribbean. And we believe that it is significant enough that these Europeans must fund these cultural institutions in the Caribbean so that our children will better appreciate and understand their history. Public health crisis. We're speaking about pandemic, and earlier on we spoke about COVID and so on. In the Caribbean, we are afflicted maybe more than you on the continent with regards to chronic disease, hypertension, and diabetes. And we are able to trace these high percentage occurrences of these diseases as a legacy of slavery and our diet. And we are saying that these European colonizers, they must fund and address the problem of our health, of the crisis we face in our health situation in the Caribbean. Illiteracy eradication is another point that we speak of in terms of a 10-point plan. African Knowledge Program. I speak English. I do not speak Swahili or any other African language. Our languages were stripped away from us, from our ancestors, when they made that Middle Passage with the slave trade and then slavery. Psychological rehabilitation. That is, to us, extremely important because in the Caribbean and certainly in Africa, many of our people see the white or the lighter skin as being superior to that of the black skin and we believe it's extremely important that the education of our people in terms of being proud of ourselves and so on is something that we need to promote. Then technology transfer. With all of the latest technologies that this world is experiencing, if we in the Caribbean and Africa were able to purchase the latest technology, we would not have resources and we were never able to catch up with the more developed countries. And as such, technology transfer is an extremely important part of our developmental program. And of course, debt cancellation. The Caribbean is heavily indebted. Our debt to GDP ratio climbs 160%, 170% basically. We pay through our nostrils, through our mouths with regards to debts. We are forever indebted from the time we were given independence. And as such, as long as we continue to spend 60 or 70 cents out of every dollar to meet our debt commitment, we believe that we'll always continue to be underdeveloped. So just in wrapping up, when we speak of reparations, we speak about the repair and the harm caused by the colonial powers, the wealth exploitation and extraction from the Caribbean, and the fact that slavery and the slave trade was the fuel for the Industrial Revolution in Europe. Thank you very much, Brian.
I realize that having traveled this far, it would be unkind for me to stop you. So just two takeaways: the system of pupillage that was introduced at the point of abolition, 1823 to 1833, the decade of emancipation, essentially compensated white slave owners or enslavers for the loss of slaves who were deemed by the Barbadian laws that they had made as property. So the British took out a loan, or the colonialists, from Rostra, and that loan was being repaid until what year? 2015. And I think all of you can link this. The irony is not only were these folks compensated at the end of slavery, those of you who got independence will know that they were also compensated when you were getting your independence. So there's been a consistent system of reparations of the oppressor, the colonizer, and etc. James.
Thank you very much, Brian. What I'm going to do is just invite us to have a little bit of an analysis of the moral argument as the centerpiece of the discussion on reparations. A lot of times we talk about reparations in the form of monetary compensations and other forms of restitution. However, because the reparations movement is about consciousness, we want to raise the moral question and put the aggressors in terms of the Western nations on the back foot in terms of the moral wrong that they committed to global Africans during the slave trade. So in this context, reparative justice has been described as the restoration of a moral state of equality that was violated by the injustice of slavery. Implicit in this idea is the unjust enrichment of the West, but also the unjust impoverishment of global Africans, both in Africa and the Caribbean. Therefore, it is important for us to ensure in our struggle for reparations that we put the West to task in terms of acknowledging the moral turpitude around the issue of colonialism and slave trade as the first step. And then we build upon that to ensure that we assess what other forms of compensation can be provided. But they must first acknowledge the moral wrong that was in the construct around slavery, colonialism, and apartheid. So there is a duty among the aggressors and the perpetrators of slave trade to admit the guilt, to express remorse and apology. But the moral compass and the moral argument around ending reparations does not stop at an apology, like we witnessed when King Charles visited Kenya recently and so on. We've had many apologies. This is not sufficient to meet the moral imperative. To meet the moral imperative, there must also be repair and atonement. I will then just quote Professor Ali Mazrui, who said that the injustices of enslavement and bondages could not have ended with formal emancipation. They can only end with the atonement of reparations. So an apology, emancipation, release of slaves, return of slaves to the motherland is only part of the journey, and reparations, where properly construed, will advance that particular journey and contribute to a holistic method of compensation. And that begins with acknowledging the moral wrong before entering modes of compensation. So there are other aspects as well that we want to look at, such as truth, compensation, debt cancellation, which obviously involves redefining Africa and the Caribbean's relationship with the multilateral development finance framework that is underpinned by the Bretton Woods institutions. So that's a very important factor when we want to consider these issues. The other factor we need to consider is the trauma that has been visited upon Africa and the Caribbean by the transatlantic slave trade, by colonialism, by apartheid. There's a lot of trauma, and there are issues of emotional justice that must be considered as part of the reparations debate. And this is being practiced by many practitioners. Those apologies, however, as we've buttressed, don't absolve Western nations for their part in slave trade. They must go further in the offer of atonement in the form of compensation, truth, healing, and as Brian said, guarantees of non-repetition. I think as well, and we were discussing this with Brian on the way here, there ought to be as well, after this, a discussion of an end to continued exploitation of natural resources in Africa. But some think perhaps that might be putting in too much into the reparations basket, and perhaps we should deal with the issues I discussed first, such as morality, then atonement. Now, how can we achieve this? I think we need some tools. We've got some excellent deliberations and declarations that have come out of the recent Accra meetings on reparations. We also have the Abuja Declaration, Durban Declaration, and many others that form a contemporary normative framework for a discussion on reparations and advancing the push for reparations. However, it is important that institutions in Africa and CARICOM take a joint approach towards this and joint messages. So the AU and CARICOM need to have the agency and be given the agency to pursue the reparations debate with the full participation of African citizens, academia, and other actors. There's an issue around pursuing an aggressor within their legal system and within their moral environment to compensate you for something that they did wrong. And that is going to have a lot of pushback and a lot of difficulty. So what the political class in Africa must be able to do in order for the reparations claims to succeed is sacrifice their strategic geopolitical capital that they have with Western nations. Because if I'm asking you to compensate me for harm that you've done to me, I cannot then continue to ask you for loans, continue to ask you for development finance, and sign every agreement, as Professor Bayo Lukoshi talked about, and Professor Rashid. So the sacrifice of political capital by African political elites, African academia, is a necessary tool towards the achievement of reparations, because this is something that is political, it is historical, and cannot be conducted programmatically without investing politically. And investing politically means that there are some countries who will definitely lose out in terms of the benefits of their relationships with the Western nations. So that must be something that's at the fore and that our leaders must be expected to be prepared for. Now, I want to propose that, one, The African Union and CARICOM come up with a joint communication strategy and joint communication approaches and joint working approaches towards seeking reparations. Further, I would like to also recommend, in ending, that perhaps the African Union and CARICOM should somehow have within them embedded reparations secretariats and technical working groups to enable us to push the agenda forward while the political actors as well push for reparations, like the President of Ghana has recently really taken the lead in this term, and we also encourage other political actors, but this must also be backed by some technical capacity and some agency at the level of the AU and CARICOM. Thank you.
The abiding question is, when the French lose and they punitively impose a financial burden on Haiti that lasts for scores of years and Haiti is impoverished, what do you call that act of demanding that you make good to Haiti and Haitians an act of economic sabotage that has kept them imperiled, impoverished? When the French, at the point of decolonization, imposed on Sahelian nations in this region, in the Sahel, restrictions with respect to their economy and financial systems that essentially mean that none of their natural resources can effectively lead to their prosperity, and they are kept in perpetual servitude. What do you call the act of making good the years of theft of those goods? It seems to me that, Lilliane, this is an appropriate time to bring you in, because you've been working pointedly on this, the European process, the Belgian process, the Netherlands. Yeah, please come in.
Can you hear me? Brian, can you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, I would share my screen. I can turn the video on, but I have a PowerPoint, so it will be easier to follow. But first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to this prestigious panel. As Brian said, my name is Lilliane Umubyeyi, and I'm the co-founder and executive director of African Futures Lab. I would like to share with you the results of this study that we conducted on reparations movements in Africa, and I think it will speak to some of the issues that you mentioned. We started this research by observing many contemporary issues related to colonial crimes and slavery. The first one that was very attracted our attention was the voting rights in the international financial institutions. We know, for instance, that a citizen in the United Kingdom has 23 times the voting power of a Nigerian citizen. We can go on and on, but the difference in terms of voting powers between European populations in the Western countries and African populations, or populations in the global South, is quite significant. And we know that this voting system dates back to colonial times. It hasn't been changed since then. On the contrary, has been reinforced after the many reforms of the Bretton Woods institutions. So that was one of the first contemporary injustices that we could see related to colonial injustices. The second one that is also very contemporary is the unequal contribution to climate crisis between European populations, European states, and African populations. We know that the US, EU, Russia, Japan count for 57% of the total global emissions. However, all African nations combined have emitted over the century 3% of the total global greenhouse gas emissions. With this difference, we know that African countries are most affected by this climate crisis. 65%, for instance, of the cultivatable land in the African Sahel has degraded. And we know that in some countries that you mentioned earlier, like Brian, like in the Sahel, like Mali, Niger, Sudan, Somalia, there have been recent drops in agricultural productivity of up to 40%. And we know that this phenomenon is a result of the colonial practices of extractions of natural resources, of a result of colonial violence against ecosystems on the African soil. And we started by observing these facts, these contemporary injustices. And after we started to ask when people did African populations start to ask reparations or justice for this. And with this research, we observed that, in fact, there have been many demands for justice and reparations over the last 60 years. For instance, I'll give you a few examples. The case that you were mentioning about the African mothers from whom mixed race children were removed by Belgian colonial administration. We know that there are cases of mobilization by civil society actors on debt inherited from colonial administration. Many African countries have inherited huge debts from colonial administration, whether it's Zimbabwe, South Africa, DRC, and many others. And some of them are still paying those debts. There have been mobilization in West Africa on the return of artifacts. In North Africa, we know that have Black Tunisian activists who have been demanding justice for slavery, for the recognition of slavery. So these demands have been there for 6 years. But the interesting fact here, or a finding of our study, is that the international development sector, the international human rights sectors have been blind to these demands. They have been explaining social and economic injustices on the African continent by focusing on poor governance, by focusing on corruption, and by eluding the responsibility of Western actors in many of the crimes, of the violence and the justices that we see on the continent. And we know that, of course, there's some responsibility of, if we look, for instance, at in the case of corruption, there's responsibility of African leaders. But at the same time, if we compare it to the amount of money taken from tax evasion, we can compare. The case here, the example here concerns some figures given by, for instance, the World Bank, on the fact that there are 30 billion lost per year in Africa because of corruption. But when we take the example of tax evasion, the amount of money is more like 1 trillion USD. So one of what I'm trying to say here is that one of the key challenges of these demands for justice and reparations has been the international development and international human rights sector that has been blind, that hasn't paid attention, that didn't provide resources to bring these demands for justice on the forefront. And we have other key challenges that we also highlight in this study. The first one, I will mention only 3 of them. But I think the first one is that many of these demands have a transnational dimension, because the harms are happening on the African continent, but the responsible actors, are state and non-state actors that are located in Europe, in Western countries. So if movements want to mobilize, want to do advocacy, want to do justice, they have to face this obstacle of transnational mobilization and the important resources that are necessary. The other challenge is the tools that we have to use. We were talking about international law, but international law was first and foremost a colonial instrument. Colonialism, slavery happened because the international law allowed to do so. So how to mobilize while using colonial instruments. And the other challenge, and maybe that'll be the last challenge that it's important to mention, is that there have been many reparations initiatives. We've talked about reparations initiative towards the owners of slaves, but we have to look at a more recent example, the case of Italy paying reparations to Gaddafi, to Libya, sorry. And these reparation initiatives is very interesting because Italy decided to pay 5 billion euros to Libya over 5 years. But the interesting thing here was there was no recognition of the harms that were done in a country. The money was given through development aid programs, so it was a highway that was going to be built in Libya, and the companies that were going to build this highway were Italian oil companies. So basically, the money that was given given to Libya was going back to the Italian citizens. So basically, the idea here is to make sure that when there are initiatives of reparations, of apologies, how we have to be careful in the way they are shaped, the way they are developed, because they are reproducing the harms that are normally set up to dismantle. I will end up yes. So I would end up with these few points. For us, reparations, as I think one of the panelists said, it's not about the past only. It's about the present. Reparation is a critical step toward tackling the crisis faced by contemporary African societies. They should, and the way they should be shaped is more with we have to adopt a more holistic approach, in the sense that we have to look, of course, at the violence that was colonial violence, that was slavery and colonial violence that was targeting individuals, groups, as the case of these African mothers and their children. But you have also to look at the injustices against communities, against states, against the cultural environment. So we cannot address one without addressing the other, because they are linked, and a more sustainable way to look at this agenda for reparations is to see how to articulate these different demands. Third point, it's fundamental from our perspective to shift from development aid policies to reparation-driven policies. We have to change the narrative from one of aid and to a narrative that sheds light on the responsibility on northern states and private actors of the global north. And the final point would to say that we must center the voices and the visions and epistemologies from the African continent. Thank you.
Thank you so much, all of you. Just to remind us that when Lumumba's tooth was returned to the DRC, there was no acceptance of the violence that attended the assassination of Patrice Lumumba. That when Sudan went through its intifada, the revolution recently, the Americans insisted that Sudan should pay reparations or compensation to the sum of 343 million in order to be taken off the terrorism list, in part because it was alleged that Osama bin Laden had been hiding in Sudan planning the bombings of Nairobi and Dar es Salaam. And the Sudanese people who had just freed themselves from dictatorship were made to pay 343 million as reparations. In 2015, the United States, through Congress, passed an act holding liable companies in Germany that were responsible for the Holocaust. What we're hearing from the panelists, friends, is that transnational mobilization is important, and that you as the intellectuals should assist in developing the most appropriate tools for engaging in this struggle, so that we are not burdened by having to use, as Audre Lorde says, you cannot bring down the master's house by using the master's tools, that the legal systems were set up to always find the empire innocent and the oppressed. I think what we've been reminded is that this holistic approach must look at physical violence and maybe psychological and emotional, but also must look at the collective violence, structural violence, including erasure of cultures, of knowledge, of innovations, of science. And I think that we've also been told that it must not only have a retrospective, it must have a prospective approach. We were told several things, I think, by the speakers. I don't want to summarize, but an interesting one is this colonially inherited debt, as well as the ecological harm caused by systems of development that were designed to make our continent and sites where Afro-descendants live sites of extraction and not sites of innovation and development, sites of experimentation, and hence the vulnerability to pandemics, vulnerability to other forms of fragilities, that things that are now being addressed as issues of development and issues of governance are actually fundamentally questions of justice or injustice that's yet to be. What I'm going to do is I'm going to turn to the audience with one set of requests. I'll ask that you make comments, you ask questions, you make suggestions. In that order, I already see a hand at the back, and I see another hand at the, I see three hands. My brother from, is it Jamaica? Right. I see Ayob, and I see, okay. All right, this is exciting. So let's start right at the back. My brother from Jamaica, we come to Ayob, we come to you, then we come up, the three hands up there, and we come down here. So please follow the example of the speakers. Keep it brief, keep it sweet, and keep it happy. Yes, sir.
And certainly with the suggestions about a unified strategic approach from African intellectuals, not just those on the continent, but the diaspora as well. I'm particularly intrigued by the point made by the last speaker, I think it's Lilliane, who reminds us that reparation should not be an aid package. The Brattle report, which is new, it came out this year, and is seeking to frame the conversation, insists that if it is genuinely reparation, then the repairers cannot be invited to determine the terms of repair, that the agenda should not include any kind of negotiation. In fact, the three pillars of the international law that the Brattle report emphasizes is, yes, there is recognition of damage, there should be restitution of damage, and then there needs to be satisfaction, you know, and the issue of satisfaction means that those deemed to have suffered more or most need to feel as though they have been adequately compensated. So I just want to raise with the assembly here that there is a new report which supports the 10-point report in framing solutions called the Brattle report, which is important. I'd love to hear Gil's feedback on that. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Brian. My name is Iyob. I'm an Ethiopian. I work at University of Bristol. My question, especially for the two speakers in the room, perhaps Lilliane can also expand on this as well, is how can we avoid being trapped into the revolving door of Eurocentrism in our effort of reparation and repatriation, in our effort of calling for this and the discourses or the orientations. Somehow building on the previous commenter and also what Lilliane mentioned about the epistemic issues, and also connecting to the previous panel that we had this afternoon. Unless we locate a new epistemic orientation, or not necessarily new, but an Africa-centered ways of doing things, so that we will not be just simply replicating the northern or the Eurocentric model of so-called development. Yes, we need technology, but not necessarily in a way that it's become contrary to our existence. Yes, we need infrastructure, but not at the expense of our future generation. So I wonder to what extent these efforts of mobilizing for reparation and repatriation can learn or can incorporate these alternative ways of knowing, so that we shape the dynamics in a way that fits into the context rather than replicating the already existing dominant hegemonic thinking framework. Thank you.
Awesome greetings. My name is Toyin Ajao from UmubyeyiAfrican, iAfrica. I just have one question for the panel. I want to know if there is a link between reparation and restorative justice, and if yes, what kind of healing does it offer us as Black, indigenous, and people of color? Thank you.
Thank you. The famous row. That famous row at the top, there are three people there.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And thank you very much to the panelists for this very, very insightful discussion. My first point was raised by the first question that was raised by Neville. My suspicion is that we are working in silos. Is there a way we can pool all resources together in Africa, with those in the Caribbean, and so that we can speak with one voice? That is the first point. The second point is, how can we begin to infiltrate even the global north? And I'm using CODESRIA as a case study. With its partnership with institutions and governments in the West, is it possible to have some direct conversation with them so that from within we can also begin to push this agenda of reparation? The third point, and I think Professor Lukoshi talked about this when he was making his response, if we do not have a responsible government in Africa. And my thinking is that this reparation agenda will be a wild goose chase. I think CODESRIA has the moral leadership to also begin to think of how the democratization process in Africa is defined. How do we elect our leaders? Because if the leaders are corrupt, it is almost impossible for us as academics to actualize this very noble reparation project. So perhaps I want to suggest that CODESRIA may begin to think of ways to have a say in the electoral process that is going on. We have heard, we have seen how some European colonial masters blatantly sponsor coups. And once they succeed, the leaders thwart whatever efforts individuals and institutions try to make. So I want to suggest that perhaps CODESRIA may begin to think of becoming politically involved, not only in individual countries, but across Africa, so that we actually do have the right leadership so that we can cooperate with the leadership and then see how we can actualize this reparation project. Thank you very much.
There were there was one hand at the top there, then you, and then I'll come to Dr. Mshai here. Yeah.
Ok, merci Monsieur le Président du panel. Je remercie également les panélistes pour la qualité de leur contribution. Ma question porte cependant sur la question des réparations. Je me souviens bien qu'en 2001, à Bamako, se tenait le 3e congrès de l'Association des historiens africains. Et à cette occasion, nous avons un collègue sénégalais, Ibrahima Tchoub, qui a appelé à une lecture plus critique de la question de la traite négrière en suggérant que les Noirs sont aussi coupables que les Européens de ce qui est arrivé à l'Afrique. Et ça a déclenché un véritable tollé dans l'amphithéâtre, sans doute la preuve que le sujet est très sensible. Mais récemment, j'ai écouté un chef d'État africain qui demandait réparation pour l'Afrique, mais en mobilisant des faits historiques qui ne sont pas du tout fondés. Il demandait réparation pour des faits historiques pas du tout fondés. Elle-même a reconnu que depuis 60 ans, pas de réparation et il n'y a pas de résultat. Finalement, est-ce qu'il n'est pas temps de changer de logiciel, de paradigme, plutôt que de laisser les hommes politiques décider de l'agenda? Et là, je rejoins le collègue qui m'a précédé. Est-ce qu'il n'est pas mieux que le CODESRIA, par exemple, définisse un agenda clair en mettant sur pied un groupe d'historiens africains chargés vraiment d'évaluer la question de la traite négrière et des autres crimes contre l'Afrique, en faire le point sur des bases vraiment historiques, pas fantaisistes, de sorte à pouvoir documenter le plaidoyer pour que, justement, on puisse obtenir des réparations. Dans ces conditions où on tire à U et à Dia, je ne suis pas très sûr que finalement la demande soit comprise. Et des historiens de talent, ce n'est pas ce qui manque en Afrique. Je pense au Nigérian Joseph Onikori, sans doute le meilleur spécialiste de la traite négrière sur l'aspect quantitatif. Alors, donc le continent a des ressources humaines dans nos universités, dans nos académies, qui sont capables de prendre ces questions de réparation à bras le corps, de la documenter sur des bases historiques très concrètes, et de sorte à pouvoir enrichir le plaidoyer. Mais dans les conditions actuelles, je suis très pessimiste quant au succès de cette revendication. J'aimerais poser la question justement à notre collègue sur la question. S'il doit y avoir réparation, elle prendrait quelle forme? Est-ce qu'on est sûr que toute l'Afrique a été concernée par la traite? Est-ce que toute l'Afrique l'a subie dans les mêmes proportions? Est-ce que des États n'ont pas participé à la traite négrière, comme les Tchédo en Sénégambie, comme les Tekere dans le centre du Mali? Voilà des questions qu'il faut soulever et qu'il faut documenter sans faux fuyant. Si nous voulons effectivement voir le continent qui a été laminé pendant des siècles dans sa dignité, je pense qu'il est temps effectivement de documenter cette question-là en laissant la parole aux historiens, aux universitaires pour la documenter sans faux fuyant et sans hypocrisie.
Thank you. I know the panelists will answer you, but if you do get a chance, Professor Hilary Beckles has done a series of 5 very eloquent documentations using, together with the report that has just been referred to, the Brattle reports, looks at the quantification. And just to remind us, it's reparations for slavery, for colonial extraction, and for apartheid. And there's a lot of research that's been done. What I find interesting, though, is each time harm has been done to white people, and I've been deliberate in saying what Sudan was forced to pay. Nobody talked about proving nexus. Sudan was made to pay the 343 million. Libya was made to pay the 600 million. The Holocaust, right? The payments has been made. Japan, for the comfort women, payment made. There's always an arithmetical problem somehow when it comes to black people, but let's discuss it afterwards. And to you, Sam.
All right, thank you very much. You see, reparations is something very important that we all must begin to take a conscious look at. But however, another thing that bothers many scholars in Africa is the fact that these reparations to African nations, a lot of the nations in Africa don't have responsible government. And I'm giving an example of my own country. Between 1999 and 2023, there have been a return of loot from different nations of the world. It is called the Abacha loot, Nigeria. Between 1999 and 2023, there have been about $4 billion return of funds stolen by the former president, and then $2 billion in assets. Now, the problem we have is that once some of these reparations are done, the government steals it in return. So they keep returning and the government keeps stealing. So we, just like one of the other speakers said, Africans must begin to demand for good governance, credibility, and accountability from its leaders for the reparations to have a good impact on sustainable development. Thank you very much.
I've got Dr. Mshai, and then I'll come. You'll be our last, sir. I'll start with Mshai there.
Thank you very much, and I really want to appreciate the panel for this, for 2 reasons. One, I think this is the first plenary panel that has the intellectuals who are speaking are not coming from within the academy. And I really want to appreciate the clarity with which you have laid out not just the political agenda, but for me also an intellectual agenda. I was reminded listening to you that my very first encounter at CODESRIA in 1998 was a Humanities Institute with the preceptor as Professor Kofi Anyudoho, where we engaged the question of enslavement. 25 years later, I don't feel that within our academy we are doing much work. For me, it was the very first time I had been in a classroom where we were talking about these issues. So I want to invite you, number one, to just share with us. I know there are many early career scholars here, and a lot of the agenda you've set out is, on the big bodies, Africa Union, CARICOM, and so on. And my first question is, what are the existing spaces that you are aware of that individual scholars, individual intellectuals can begin to congregate? Because I think even people doing this work often find themselves as being very lonely, especially if you're in the academic space as opposed to the policy or civil society space. And then the second one is an invitation to dream with us, because here we have vice chancellors, we have rectors, we have deans, we have professors. What would your dream for a pedagogical agenda and a research agenda at our African institutions of higher education look like? And again, thank you.
Thanks, Prof.
Thank you very much. Let me join the others in thanking the panelists. Going back to the first presentation, I just want our colleague to know that a little about a year and a half ago, I was invited by CARICOM to Bridgetown, Barbados, a dialogue between Africa and the Caribbean. And this was the center of the discussions. The final session, we were made to understand that there was going to be a big follow-up involving more people, and that this was going to happen in Nairobi, only for me to discover that it has been shifted to Switzerland, Geneva. And it was a huge gathering of African people from all over, especially the Caribbean, except that this was not being organized by us. It was being organized and guided from New York. A follow-up happened a few months ago in June, again in New York, under the cover of a new body set up by the United Nations, the Permanent Forum of African People, who have taken up this discussion and demands on reparation. Yes, many of the speakers, both in Geneva and in New York, came from various parts of the African world, but my worry is that the whole program is not being coordinated and directed by African people themselves. How do we avoid this movement being hijacked? That's my question. About the failure of the African leadership, some of them. I was amazed when I discovered recently that Ghana was going to host a major forum on reparations. And I remember very clearly that a former president of our country in 2007, on the 200th anniversary of what? The so-called abolition of the Slave Trade Act, as one of our speakers spoke about, declared openly in the presence of, right there in Elmina Castle, filled with especially many, many people from the diaspora. He stood up on that evening, he was there in person, and said there was no need for even an apology for slavery, for the enslavement of African people, because as he put it, it was trade. And he claimed we all benefited. What were our benefits? Maybe for his family and little group, maybe they benefited. How do we make sure that our leaders don't what? Undermine this movement as expressed by this former president, who at the time was chairman of either the African Union or ECOWAS. We have to watch them and stop them before they damage an otherwise useful program for reparation and restitution of justice. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Lilliane, we will start with you. You don't have to answer all the questions. The beauty of being in CODESRIA is that I think that many people here are deeply interested in the subject, and perhaps this was just to remind us of that collective interest. Please answer one or two questions, take 3 minutes, or say things that you wanted to say that you didn't get to say. And then we will come to you, James, and then Ali will end with you. Go ahead, Lilliane. My sister.
Fantastic questions. I would like to to answer to 2 or 3 questions, but summed up in one response. I think what we are talking here is the process of reparations, how the demands are being made, how the response or the actions of whether we're talking about the European states or the Western states, or whether we're talking about African states, what are their role, and what are the risks in this process of reparations. And I think to answer the first question of the demands, I think I've said it earlier, but I think it's fundamental to set up these transnational alliances, because first of all, we strengthen our position by working through these different continents, with different movements. But I think if we constitute a united front, I think we will have much more power in the discussion or in the demands for reparations. The second aspect is this issue of alternative epistemologies. I think it's very key in some reparations demands that we have seen, in particular those regarding the restitution of artifacts. We know that the response of many European states was to say, "Oh, we have looted you, so we're going to send the objects back." Not all of them, but at least like 1% of those, and they don't consider at all the environment where these artifacts were taken from, how they were taken care of by the communities, or the vision, the cultural vision, the cultural environments that were from where they were taken. And they didn't take into consideration that the violence was not only about the object or the artifact, it was about like the environment in general. So we have to be careful in the way we center the communities or the visions of the communities in these efforts of reparations. The third element that I would like to, and the last one I would like to add, I think is this risk about Western states hijacking these movements, and also African state instrumentalizing these movements. I think we have to be aware that these risks are serious. We know that in the past, France, for instance, has approached some of the governments when at the level of the EU, when there was this in the early 90s, when there was these efforts to demand reparations. So it won't be the first time. It's a recipe from colonial states. So the risk is there, and the question is, how do we anticipate that risk, and what do we put in place to mitigate that risk? And the idea of set up this common front, I think it's important. And the issue of the last issue, which is the responsibility of African leaders, African governments, I think it's fundamental, because we know that, and this is something that we've seen in our study, is that many civil society actors are reluctant to enter this movement for reparations, because they say like, these leaders have been there for so many years and haven't done anything on that. Why do we now start to talk about reparations? So I think we have to take these fears seriously, and integrate them, also mitigate them, try to find ways to mitigate them. But at the same time, realize that we can't we can't set aside the role of states, because if we're talking about international financial institutions, we talk about the international governments, we talk about geopolitics, and how it is important to bring this issue into debate on reparations. It's fundamental to have states working alongside civil society actors. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that very lively input to this discussion. I'll address the issue of my brother raised about avoiding Eurocentrism in the debate on reparations and avoiding the discourse being hijacked by the West and Western institutions. I think one of the challenges we face with international law is that the normative frameworks are always dominated by the global North at the expense of the global South. And international law is always sometimes constructed in a manner that befits the victor states post-1945, post-World War II. Therefore, sometimes when it comes to a situation where it is Africa or the Caribbean or the states in the global South seeking to apply international law to seek a remedy, such as reparations, we might find that it is not properly facilitative and not sufficient. So we might want to consider developing and using existing Pan-African normative instruments and frameworks. And I would dare to recommend perhaps a Pan-African treaty on reparations, which has retrospective application and jurisdiction to cover periods prior to colonialism, to the transatlantic slave trade, to apartheid, and so on. And that's something we should consider. The other one is, as my sister Mushai said, to mobilize and convene Pan-African academia, so that we set our own ideas, ideology that informs then perhaps the legal and policy instruments that we use in pursuit of reparations. The other thing is using Pan-African institutions like CODESRIA, like there are very many, the Pan-African Lawyers Union, there are very many Pan-African organizations which would have the sufficient technical nous to be able to develop and help facilitate the development of normative frameworks that are Afrocentric as opposed to Eurocentric. On the issue of silos that was raised, I think CARICOM has been doing a very good job, and recently we've also seen a new push in the Accra summits from the African Union, but there's a need for a joint approach towards advocacy around reparations, both from jointly with AU and CARICOM working together, but also with the Pan-African citizens from the Caribbean and Africa working together in pursuit. Then we'll avoid the issue of silos that was raised on that end. That would be all.
Brother Ali.
Thank you very much. I'll just briefly go through a few pointers as I close. And just to say that we in the Caribbean have been championing the issue of reparations for centuries. We must not forget that they enslaved us, the formerly, or the former slaves themselves demanded reparations. And right throughout our history, persons like Marcus Garvey, Sir Arthur Lewis, Dr. Eric Williams, and so have always championed the cause of reparations. In 2013, what we've had is that the heads of government has formally put it on the national agenda at CARICOM level. And just to say that the Brattle report in quantifying the harm or the damage which was caused and looked at the issue of compensation in terms of $120 to $130 trillion. And it's a very good document for persons who have not read or at least go through it as yet to look at. It gives us, it's an excellent tool for us going forward with regards to speaking about reparations. Also, too, we now have another project called the Repair Project in the Caribbean, where it is funded economic and social development programs for each Caribbean island. The researchers from the University of the West Indies are going through different islands and developing and costing, doing a costing of development projects for us in the Caribbean. Now, what I really want to comment on, and we have a lot of academics and deans and so on, and Professor spoke about it earlier, and one of our colleagues. How many universities, colleges in Africa is teaching the subject of reparations? But while we speak about the leadership of Africa and the leadership of Caribbean, and let's not forget Latin America and so on. What I believe we need as well in this reparation struggle is grassroots engagement and leadership among our students across universities and colleges. I think one positive takeaway from us here with all of the academics and intellectuals that we have here is that when we return to our universities and college, can we positively put reparations on the agenda? The University of the West Indies, along with the University of Glasgow, has just started in September, a master's degree on the subject of reparations. And I believe that universities in Africa can do that as well. We need to engage our young people so that the issue or the subject of reparations cannot only be that of intellectuals and advocates and academics. It has to be among the young people of Africa and the Caribbean, the youths. How can we use the media in Africa to agitate and to educate and to bring this subject of reparations alive in every alley, in every nook and every cranny and every street and community centers and so on? I think that we need to have a groundswell of the discussion on reparations. And Professor earlier spoke about, conferences in Switzerland and so on and so forth. Well, one of the harsh realities is that we need African governments and Caribbean governments to invest in the subject of reparations. And it must be seen seriously enough as an economic development program that they will make allocations in their budget to fund the struggle of reparations. This struggle of reparations maybe cannot be won by just sheer volunteerism. I am a volunteer. Many other persons I know volunteer in the struggle of reparations. But we need proper secretariats. We need funding so that we can do educational programs on mass media and so on. And it cannot be left up to chance. So that the challenges for financiers, our leaders, our governments, and so on, is that they see this issue of reparations serious and significant enough that they would make it part of the budgetary allocations on an annual basis so that we can get funding, so that we can fund these conferences. Bring our best historians and our philosophers and advocates together in Dhaka and Accra and Bridgetown and so on and so forth. That is one of the things that we continue to miss out on, and we need funding from our leaders and so. And just in closing, I want to reemphasize the point that was made earlier. When we speak of reparations, we're not speaking of an aid package. Reparations is not charity. It's extremely important so that when we see institutions in Europe and so on say they're giving 50 million euros, or the Church of England speaking of $100 million, these persons who have benefited from the Atlantic slave trade and slavery cannot be the judge and the jury with regards to reparations. They cannot take it upon themselves to decide how much monies they will make available to us as part of reparative justice. And more than that, decide how it should be spent and which organization they should give it to. We consider that to be utterly disrespectful, and it speaks again to the superiority complex that these, Brian, can I say white folks continue to have with regards to this issue of reparations. So that reparations at the end of the day is a debt that should be paid, and it is not charity. It is not an aid package. Thank you very much.
Thank you. My friends, I come from a small country called Zimbabwe. When the colonial forces were occupying my country, a young girl, 26-year-old, felt she had been possessed and directed by the spirit of a great female warrior called Nehanda. She led the men of my country to fight against colonial occupation. The colonial government hung her where the State House sits today. Her crime was treason. The only state that existed at the time she was hung was the state for which she was fighting in defense of. Having defeated Chief Chengaira and other chiefs, the colonial company that occupied our country decapitated their heads and took them to the United Kingdom as trophies in museums. The story of my ancestors is the same story of Sarah Batman, who was taken as an artifact because white folk couldn't get over her bodily parts. It's the same story across the continent, where they took gods and they call them now artifacts. And once you have degraded gods into artifacts, you return them as a point of charity. My sister Fumi, Professor Fumi, my sister Mshai, many other sisters in the room have over the years in trying to teach me, reminded me of what happens in our villages. An elderly male rapes an underage girl, and because of poverty, insists that in order to avoid accountability, they'll make the child their bride. The crime is hidden in what appears to be an act of magnanimity. The criminal is called a breadwinner. We cannot allow what happens to our daughters in our villages to happen to our continent. A criminal cannot be absolved purely by paying dowry, because that same criminal will keep raping. My brothers and sisters, I was remotely involved in the Abacha loot and Mobutu loot conversations and processes. The Swiss refused and insisted, Professor Olukoshi is here, that we should prove that the money was actually public money. That in the absence of proof, they were not willing to return the interest. To this day, the Swiss have not returned the full amounts. The real criminal at law, anybody who receives stolen property under all our legal systems, is a thief. And yet, Transparency International and all our ranking agencies will tell you that the cleanest country in the world is Switzerland. It was the Swiss bankers who forced Mozambique into taking a loan that it did not need, and we arrested the Mozambican finance minister in the 2 billion scandal. Somehow, Credit Suisse and others somehow escaped liability for having transacted. What am I saying? I'm not saying that we should excuse our people. I'm just reminding us of what already exists. University of Western Cape has set up something, a desk, a center to deal with reparations. University of West Indies, together with Glasgow, CODESRIA, Africa Judges and Juries Forum, International Law Center, Pan-African Lawyers Union, and several African entities have started doing this. The meeting today was to say it's inadequate to have a few of us. I am not trying to prove myself, my pain, to any European. I'm not trying to make legal or technical sense. You ask a rape victim to prove she was raped? How did Leopold's Congo become Leopold's? My brothers and sisters, there's no Tarzan raised by monkeys that's going to come and save us and fight against the predatory instinct of recolonization. We're not going to negotiate ourselves out of the quagmire we find ourselves in, where globalization is militarized and financialized, by pleading the accuracy of the mathematics of the extent to which we've been looted. No, nobody's ever going to admit. Even the Catholic Church is offering 100 million, yet we paid America through Sudan, 343 million for 200 people. Why? Millions of Africans are worth less than 200. I'm not mocking those who died. It's just to remind us that this conversation is racialized. It's racialized because even amongst ourselves, we have bought this logic that actually says, for some reason, we must make sense to the thief, to the looter, to the robber. We must make sense to the rapist. We must make sense to ourselves. Do we have bad governments? We have terrible governments, but the Americans, Madam Chair, have worse. Kissinger, who died recently, finally history has begun to judge him. And yet our kids studying international relations were studying the Kissinger doctrine. Whitewashed, enslaved, and etc. So in ending this conversation, Madam Chair, the African Union sent a study tour to CARICOM, to Barbados. the African Union agreed to adopt a common Africa position on reparations. The African Union allowed or asked that they be hosted a reparations conference. That reparations conference suggests a joint AU CARICOM position and a United Nations reparations resolution. There is a rethinking globally of multilateralism, and Lilliane has told us it ought to be anchored on a reparative economic logic, a reparative institutional logic. If you ask a stupid man like me, because I'm not an academic and I'm not trying to dethrone or minimize the importance of intellectual rigor, let me say this to you. I was a lawyer, and I think a reasonable lawyer, as my friends here will tell you, and accounting firms, consultancy firms, bankers, every day are continuing the legacy of slavery, of colonialism. The African Development Bank is supporting my government to pay reparations to white commercial farmers. Nobody has asked what formula did they use. My sister, they'd borrowed from banks when the land was expropriated in the national interest. Nobody has asked, can you show us how much you owed so that we deduct what we're paying you? No. The premise and basis of international re-engagement set under the Cotonou Agreement and insisted upon by the Americans under Zidera is pay first, and then we'll talk later. Now, here is an understanding we must get. My ancestors, Ayob, the Monday Charter of 1325, passed not far from here, the first written constitution in the world. It wasn't the French, it was an African, the Monday Charter. It had in it reparations as a principle. Shona culture, Kikuyu culture, Hausa culture, Yoruba culture, all of them have repair as a central piece. So as we go home having discussed reparations, the fundamental question is, how do we produce the knowledge, the scholarship? How do we produce the public narrative? How do we produce the dialogues? Not to end, because we're not going to win the reparations argument tomorrow. It will suffice if everyone in this group starts a fire that keeps burning 20, 30 years from now. Because what was stolen and the discovery of what was stolen, none of the speakers talked about technology, inventions done by slaves, by black people under colonialism and under apartheid. Nobody talked about that. Nobody talked about how the Royal Dutch Company stole from the Khoi and the San cattle that made them wealthy, that they sold to other people. Nobody. My friends, nobody talked about your ancestors who worked for free labor. Free labor, rendered free labor. And how do I quantify that? Easy. The colonial system that sent my ancestors underground into mines and did not pay them, that forced them to come and work on white plantation by imposing taxation on them. It documented how much tax it was collecting from the natives. Now the granddaughters and the grandsons of the natives are here. It's payback time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you, speakers, colleagues. That was a fantastic panel. This has been a long day, but you would concur with me that it was worth staying. Can you hear me now? So we've had a long day, but I think it was very worth the wait. Tomorrow, we plan to start at 9 sharp, so please be at the room called Flamboyant, on the ground floor near the baobab tree. So we're meeting there 10 to 9, roughly. Thank you very much for being here today.
On behalf of the Association of African Universities with headquarters in Accra, Ghana, I wish to congratulate the Council for the Development of Social Science Research in Africa, CODESRIA, on your 58th year anniversary. Since inception, CODESRIA has extended the frontiers of social science research and knowledge production in Africa. We are proud of your CODESRIA journals and CODESRIA bulletin conveying information and addressing challenges facing Africa and providing solutions. We are very proud of your doctoral student mentorship program and various other programs that has helped to advance the quality